The state trooper hadn't even finished laughing when the radio on his belt went quiet, in a way radios almost never do. Not static, not silence, something closer to the world holding its breath. His name was Dale Pruitt, and he had been driving the same battered Kenworth T680 along the same stretch of I-40 for 11 years, hauling general freight between Amarillo and Albuquerque with the kind of quiet reliability that nobody in the logistics industry ever stops to celebrate. He was 61 years old. He walked with a limp that came and went depending on the weather and the hours behind the wheel, and on cold mornings like this one, February in the Texas Panhandle, the sky the color of an old bruise. The limp was pronounced enough that Trooper Holt noticed it from 40 yards away and made a decision about the man before he ever checked a single document. Trooper Kendall Holt was 27. He had been with the Texas Department of Public Safety for 14 months, long enough to feel ownership over his stretch of highway, but not long enough to have learned the difference between authority and arrogance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had never been made to feel small. He saw the limping man climbing down from the cab of the old Kenworth at the Amarillo way station, and he felt something he would later struggle to name. Not contempt exactly, but a close cousin of it. The truck was clean, the load documents were in order, the registration was current. There was nothing wrong, but he found something anyway, the way some men always do when they are looking for a reason rather than the truth. The rear mud flaps. A small reflective strip on the passenger side mud flap was cracked, one edge curling away from the mounting bracket. It was the kind of violation that most troopers would note and move on from, the kind that existed in the statute books to give officers discretion rather than obligation. Holt cited it. He wrote it up slowly, deliberately, while Dale Pruitt stood beside his truck on the cold asphalt and waited with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes fixed on the middle distance in a way that Holt found, for reasons he couldn't articulate, faintly unsettling. "You know what this costs you?" Holt said, not looking up from his citation pad. "I expect you'll tell me," Dale said. The flatness of it made Holt look up. There was nothing hostile in the old trucker's face. No anger, no humiliation, no trace of the performance most people put on when they were fighting the urge to argue with a badge. Just patience. The deep, geological patience of a man who had waded through things that made a cracked mud flap look like a warm spring afternoon. Holt decided he didn't like it. $212. Plus, you'll need to address the violation before you leave this station. He let a pause develop. Then, loud enough for the two other truckers waiting at the scales to hear, "How long's it take a man your age to change a mud flap, assuming you can get down there without throwing your hip out?" One of the other truckers laughed. The other looked away. Dale Pruitt said nothing. He took the citation, folded it once, and placed it in the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. Then he walked, slowly, yes, the limp noticeable on the cold morning asphalt, back toward the cab of his truck to retrieve his toolkit. Holt watched him go, satisfied in the way that small men are satisfied by small victories, and went back to his cruiser to run the plates through the system as a formality. The system ran the plates. And then something happened that Trooper Kendall Holt had never experienced in 14 months on the job and would spend a very long time trying to explain afterward. The screen came back not with the standard registration information, but with a single field flagged in amber, which in the DPS database indicated a notification request from a federal agency. Holt had seen that flag twice in his career. Both times it was a straightforward matter, a vehicle connected to an insurance fraud investigation, a routine follow-up request. He clicked through. The notification read, "Contact requested. Agency, DOD-OSD. Reference, Logistics Command Northern." He stared at it. DOD was the Department of Defense. OSD was the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He read it again. Then he picked up his radio. The watch commander at the Amarillo DPS station listened to Holt read the notification aloud and was quiet for a moment. "Run it again," he said. Holt ran it again. Same result. "Don't let that truck leave," the watch commander said, and his voice had changed in a way that made Holt sit up straighter without fully understanding why. "I'm making a call." Dale Pruitt had his toolbox open on the asphalt beside the rear axle when Holt came back. The old trucker was on one knee, working the mounting bolts on the mud flap bracket with practiced efficiency, not hurrying but not wasting emotion either. "Sir," Holt said, "I need you to hold off on that for a moment." Dale looked up. "Problem?" "Just a routine hold. Shouldn't be long." Dale nodded, set down his wrench, and sat back on the rear bumper of the Kenworth with his hands resting on his knees. He looked at the horizon. He looked at the sky. He did not look at his phone, which many people would have. He did not look at Holt, which most people would have. He simply sat with a quality of stillness that was different from resignation. It was the stillness of a man who had learned, a very long time ago, that waiting was sometimes the most important skill a person could have. 40 minutes passed. Holt had been back to his cruiser twice. The watch commander had called him back once to confirm the vehicle was still on site. A second call had come from a number with a Washington area code that Holt had never seen before, asking him to confirm the full name on the registration. Dale Edward Pruitt. He confirmed it. The call disconnected without another word. A pickup truck from the way station's administrative office pulled up beside Holt's cruiser and the station's supervisor, a heavy-set woman named Marilyn Reyes, who had worked this station for 19 years, climbed out looking like she'd been told something she was still processing. She walked straight to Dale Pruitt. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "can I get you some coffee? Inside?" Dale looked at her, a small shift in his expression, something almost like amusement, carefully contained. "I'm fine out here," he said. "Thank you, Marilyn." She blinked. "You know my name?" "Your grandfather ran a fuel depot outside Clovis, Raymond Reyes. You used to bring him lunch on Saturdays when you were about 8 years old." He paused. "I hauled for him once or twice, back when I was just starting out. You probably don't remember." Marilyn Reyes stared at him. Then she said very quietly, "How old are you, Mr. Pruitt?" "Old enough," he said. Holt, standing 10 feet away, felt the first faint stirring of something he couldn't name, not quite unease, not quite curiosity, something in between. He looked at the old man sitting on the bumper of an aging Kenworth in the flat February cold, with his scarred hands resting on his knees and his eyes on the distant caprock, and he thought, "Who are you?" He didn't say it, but the question had arrived, and it didn't leave. The answer, when it began to come, did not come the way Holt expected. It did not arrive as an explanation. It arrived as a series of things that didn't fit together until suddenly, all at once, they did. The way a photograph develops in a dark room, nothing there, and then everything there. And you understand that the image was always complete. You simply couldn't see it yet. The first thing that didn't fit was the watch. Holt noticed it when Dale rolled up his sleeve slightly to check the time. An old mechanical watch, military style, the case scratched and worn to the color of old pewter. Not a collector's piece. Not a display. Something that had been worn continuously for a very long time. The band was a replacement, newer leather, but the case was original and old, and on the case back, just visible as Dale shifted his wrist, were engraved letters too small for Holt to read from where he stood. The second thing was the reaction of the two other truckers. They had both been held at the station as a precaution while the hold was in place. Standard procedure, Holt had told them, wouldn't be long. But one of them, a broad man in his 50s named Garrett, who ran the Amarillo to Lubbock circuit, had been watching Dale Pruitt for the last 20 minutes with an expression that wasn't curiosity or impatience, but something older and more specific. When Dale caught his eye, Garrett gave a small nod, barely perceptible. Dale returned it. Holt watched the exchange and understood nothing about it except that it meant something. The third thing was the phone call that Dale didn't make. He had been sitting on that bumper for over an hour. He had not called a dispatcher, had not called a lawyer, had not called anyone to explain the delay. Most drivers held at a station had their phones out within 15 minutes, managing their schedules, calling their contacts, building a case. Dale Pruitt sat with his hands on his knees and waited as though time was something he had long since stopped fighting. Marilyn Reyes had gone back inside. Holt was standing beside his cruiser when another call came. This one, routed through the DPS dispatch frequency rather than his personal line, which meant it had been escalated through official channels, which meant someone had gone to the trouble of doing that rather than simply calling him directly. The dispatcher's voice was neutral in the careful way of someone relaying a message they don't fully understand. Trooper Holt, I have a relay from Northern Command. They're asking for your location and the status of a subject. They used the designation, a pause, paper rustling, Iron Harbor. Does that mean anything to you? Holt looked at Dale Pruitt sitting on the bumper of the Kenworth. No, he said, it doesn't. They said if you have a male subject, approximately 60, at your location, they want him to know that Northern Command sends its regards. Those were the exact words. Northern Command sends its regards. Holt ended the transmission and walked toward Dale. Sir, he said, I have a relay for you. He read the message. Northern Command sends its regards. Dale Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the asphalt. Then he looked up at the sky, and Holt saw something cross his face. Not quite grief, not quite relief, but something that had been carried a long time and was now slightly less heavy. Tell them acknowledged, Dale said. And tell them I'm on schedule. On schedule for what? Holt asked before he could stop himself. Dale looked at him with an expression that was not unkind. Son, he said, there are questions that have answers and questions that have histories. You're asking the second kind. He stood up from the bumper, picked up his wrench, and went back to the mud flap. Holt stood there and let the words settle. What happened over the next 90 minutes dismantled everything Trooper Kendall Holt thought he understood about the geography of power. It began with a black Ford Expedition pulling into the way station lot, no markings, government plates, followed by a second one. Two men in civilian clothes got out of the first vehicle. They were not police and not military in any visible sense, but they moved with the specific economy of people who had spent time in environments where unnecessary motion was a liability. One of them, the taller of the two, walked directly to Marilyn Reyes' office. The other walked to Holt. You're the responding trooper? The man asked. He showed identification. Defense Intelligence Agency. Yes, sir, Holt said. The hold is released. Mr. Pruitt is cleared to proceed whenever he's ready. The man looked at Holt with a measured expression. The citation you issued will be processed through standard channels. We're not asking you to rescind it, but I'd like you to understand something. He paused. The man you cited this morning has logged more than 2 million miles over the last 11 years. He has never had an accident, never had a DUI, never had a major violation. You know why? Holt didn't answer. Because he is the most disciplined person you will ever encounter in a professional context, the man said, and the cracked mud flap has already been fixed. He glanced toward the truck where Dale was replacing his tools in the box. He fixed it the moment you walked away to your cruiser. He just didn't tell you. The man from the DIA walked back toward the expedition. He did not explain further. He did not offer a file, a clearance level, a biography, or a history. He got in the vehicle and the two expeditions sat in the lot, engines running, waiting. Waiting for what? Holt was about to understand. The call came over the statewide emergency management frequency at 11:47 a.m. Interstate 40 westbound, mile marker 96, a multi-vehicle accident involving a fuel tanker and two commercial freight trucks. The tanker had jackknifed across both westbound lanes and was leaking, not yet ignited, but the temperature was wrong and the leak rate was wrong, and the first responders on scene were establishing a perimeter because none of them had handled a fuel tanker leak of this size, and the tanker driver was still in the cab, conscious, his door jammed. Behind the tanker, a quarter-mile of traffic was stopped and growing. Two of the stopped vehicles had minor collision damage from the initial chain reaction. One was a school bus. The call was ongoing when Holt looked toward the Kenworth and saw that Dale Pruitt had already stowed his toolbox and was standing at the driver's door, one hand on the mirror, listening to the emergency frequency on the small external radio he apparently kept mounted on the exterior of his cab, volume low, always on. Holt walked toward him. Mr. Pruitt, I know the marker, Dale said. He was looking west down the highway. I came through there an hour ago. There's a drainage culvert on the north shoulder about 40 yards east of where the tanker will have stopped. If it goes up, the drainage runs toward the overpass foundation. He said it without drama, the way an engineer describes a condition. Your perimeter needs to be extended. Holt stared. How do you? I've driven that stretch 800 times. Dale looked at him. I know every inch of it. He paused. Who's the incident commander on scene? Captain Ruiz, Palo Duro unit. Tell Captain Ruiz the tanker valve access is on the driver's side rear, not the standard position. The company modified the configuration in 2019. Standard approach will cost him 20 minutes he doesn't have. He said it quietly, without emphasis, and got into his truck. Holt transmitted the information. Captain Ruiz confirmed it 40 seconds later. They had already found the valve in the wrong position and lost time. The correction Pruitt had given them put them back on track. The tanker driver was extracted 17 minutes later. The leak was controlled. The fuel did not ignite. The school bus moved through the cleared lane and continued west. Holt stood at the edge of the way station lot and watched the Kenworth pull out onto I-40. He watched it until it was gone. Then he turned to where the two black expeditions had been parked and found that they were also gone, without sound, without announcement, the way certain things depart, as if they had never quite fully arrived. He went back to his cruiser and sat for a long time with the engine off. He pulled up the federal notification on his screen again. DOD, OSD, Logistics Command, Northern. He looked at the name, Dale Edward Pruitt. He thought about the watch with the engraving he hadn't been able to read. He thought about the man from the DIA and the careful way he had said the most disciplined person you will ever encounter. He thought about the nod that the other trucker, Garrett, had given across 40 feet of cold asphalt. He thought about Iron Harbor. He typed the designation into his department terminal, knowing it would return nothing, and it returned nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Dale Pruitt had been driving west for 90 minutes when the second thing happened. The thing that Holt would only learn about much later, through a conversation he wasn't supposed to be part of. In a break room at the Amarillo DPS station, between Marilyn Reyes and a man named Sergeant First Class Tovar, who had driven up from Fort Bliss for reasons he described as personal. Tovar was 44, lean, with the hands of someone who worked outdoors, and the eyes of someone who had worked in places the outdoors description didn't quite cover. He had driven 3 hours to Amarillo because he had seen the federal notification flag trigger in a system he wasn't supposed to have access to anymore, but still did, because the man who had given him access to it had told him once, with a completeness that precluded argument, to never let that flag pass unread. He sat in Marilyn Reyes' break room and drank bad coffee and told her, in the quiet way of someone who has decided that some stories deserve to be spoken aloud at least once, the part of Dale Pruitt's history that could be told without a clearance. Dale had driven trucks before he drove trucks for money. He had driven them in places that don't appear on maps that civilians see, along routes that were planned in facilities that civilian contractors don't enter, under conditions that made a February morning on I-40 look like a rest day. He had driven trucks through mountain passes in weather that grounded helicopters and stopped armored vehicles, carrying things that other men couldn't be trusted to carry, arriving at coordinates that other men couldn't be trusted to reach. He had done this for 22 years. He had never had an accident. Not once. Not on a paved American highway. Not on a mountain logging track in a country that officially denied American presence. Not on a desert route with no markings and no lights, and a window of darkness that lasted exactly 4 hours. Not once. The limp came from the last mission. A vehicle failure, not his. The lead vehicle in a convoy had lost its steering in conditions that didn't allow for stopping, and Dale had maneuvered his own truck to absorb the impact rather than let the lead vehicle roll down an embankment with 3 men in it. He had kept control. All 3 men in the lead vehicle had walked away. Dale had not, initially. It had taken 2 surgeries and 14 months of physical therapy before he walked again at all. The limp was what was left. He considered it a reasonable trade. He had retired from that work, if retired was the right word, which Tovar said with a slight pause that suggested he was still determining the correct vocabulary, and had gone back to what he had done before, hauling freight on American highways. moving things from where they were to where they needed to be, doing it quietly, reliably, without accident, without complaint. The challenge coin on the seat of his cab, Tovar mentioned it, though he had not seen it that day, was the one thing Dale had kept from that period. It was not military issue. It was not from any unit with a publicly acknowledged name. It was a flat disk of dark metal with no image and no text, only a single line of coordinates along the rim, coordinates that corresponded to a location in a mountain range in a country whose name Tovar did not say. The coin had been made by hand by a man named Elias Cord, who was the best driver Dale had ever served alongside, and who had given coins to the 6 people he considered his brothers, and who was now buried at a national cemetery in a section where the stones were government standard, but the flag on the record had been folded an additional time that no civilian regulation required. Dale carried the coin in the same pocket where he had just placed Holt's citation. Marilyn Rise sat quietly when Tovar finished. Outside the break room window, the way station was running its ordinary afternoon, trucks pulling in and out, the flat Texas sky moving west. "Why does he still drive?" she asked. Tovar thought about it for a moment. "Because it's what he knows," he said, "and because he's good at it, and because—" He stopped, then went ahead. "Because when you've spent 22 years moving things through the world without anyone knowing you were there, driving a truck on an American highway feels like the most honest thing you can do." He set his coffee cup down. He's not hiding. He never was. He's just another pause, not explaining. The afternoon light was long and golden on the panhandle when Dale Pruitt's Kenworth crossed into New Mexico. He had the radio on low, the emergency frequency still open in the background, the way he always drove, aware, calm, present. The cab was clean, the load was secure, his log was current. He had 8 hours until Albuquerque, and no reason to push. He thought briefly about the young trooper. Not with bitterness, there was none of that. The young man had done what young men with a small amount of power sometimes do, and that was a lesson the world would teach him without Dale's help. What stayed with him was something smaller and less easily categorized, the look on the trooper's face at the end, when Dale had given him the information about the tanker valve. The look of a man who is beginning to understand that the map he has been using does not cover the territory he is standing in. Dale had worn that look himself once. A long time ago, in a briefing room, when a man he would spend 22 years following had laid out a map on a table and said quietly, "There are routes that don't exist on paper. They still have to be driven. The question isn't who knows about them. The question is who's capable of driving them." Dale had looked at the map and understood, for the first time, the scope of what he was being asked to do. And he had said nothing, because there had been nothing to say. He had simply been ready. He was still ready. That was the thing about the discipline Tovar described to Marilyn Reyes. It didn't have an off switch, and it didn't have a retirement date. You didn't stop being capable of what you were capable of because a calendar changed. You carried it. You carried it the way you carried the coin in your pocket, quietly, without display, because it was yours, and it was real, and it had been earned in the kind of weather and the kind of dark that most people would never encounter. The Northern Command relay, their regards, they had said, and he knew what that meant. Knew it the way you know the voices of people who have stood beside you in the places where standing beside someone means something permanent. Had done something to the temperature of the day. Not warmth, exactly, something more structural. The recognition that the tether was still there, even after all the years, even after the surgeries and the silence and the freight depot in Amarillo and the bad coffee in truck stop diners at 3 in the morning. The tether was there. Elias Cord had believed in tethers, had talked about them in the particular way of a man who doesn't talk about the things that matter to him very often. He had said once, sitting in the dark of a vehicle on a hillside waiting for a window of safe movement, that the thing about brotherhood is it doesn't require maintenance. You don't have to polish it. You don't have to check on it. It's either there or it isn't, and if it's there, time is not a factor. Dale had said nothing in response, which was the correct response, and Elias had known it was the correct response, and they had sat in the dark together until the window opened and Dale had driven them through it. He reached into his breast pocket and found the folded citation between his fingers. He thought about leaving it there, carrying it west the way he carried the coin, the way he carried the limp, the way he carried the coordinates on the dark metal disc. He thought about the $212, which was nothing, and the cracked mud flap, which he had already fixed, and the trooper's laugh, which had already dissolved into the cold panhandle air without leaving a trace. He put the citation back in his pocket. The highway unrolled ahead of him, straight and clear and long, the way the best routes always are when you know how to drive them. And Dale Pruitt drove west toward Albuquerque in the ordinary winter afternoon, carrying everything he carried, saying nothing to no one, as reliable as a compass and as quiet as a man who has already proven everything he will ever need to prove, and found that proving it, when it mattered, was enough. The radio was low. The load was secure. The miles moved beneath him like something that had always been his. He was on schedule.